So what is it that we can pick up in nature as far as microevolution? How can you look at this? Well, we've mentioned that microevolution is this change in allele frequency. So this is the number or ratio of different variable alleles in a population. So think about this as the number of individuals in the human population with brown eyes, the number of individuals in the human population with blue eyes. Does this change over time? As our population changes, do we see more or less individuals with brown eyes or blue eyes? Well, eye color isn't necessarily something that we would look at as evolving, but we can certainly look at it throughout human population history to understand where some human populations and particular individuals may have come from originally based on eye color. It's kind of interesting. But what we want to think about then later on is how these kinds of changes may actually lead to a species formation. Is the selection for a given allele so strong that the population actually shifts to having only that one allele type? When we look at this together, we can think about what we call evolutionary divergence. So what does it mean to diverge? Just a split, right? So in our frogs that we talked about before, when the intermediate color pattern is no longer seen in the new generations, but we see instead a light color pattern and a dark color pattern, that's a divergence in the population. It's a split in that population. Now, we can actually see this occurring in nature. You can look at different environments and you can put organisms and individuals into different environments, and populations over time will show significant shifts. So what we want to look at is what has to change to really drive that population to split or diverge in their allele frequency and then eventually become new species. So bugs are weird. You know that. Here are a couple of examples of some really weird bugs, right? Here's a mantid, his head and body, and here's a flower mantid. These are very strange ones. Beautiful, but very strange. So the head, legs, and body. But when they're in their natural environments, they blend in, right? They're camouflaged. Why is camouflage good? Camouflage equals survival, right? You avoid being someone's dinner. But if we move this flower mantid down here onto the leaves, or this leaf mantid up here onto the flower, do you think they would survive? There's no way, right? So what we have to think about is in populations, what is it that's driving fitness and survival? Some of you may be familiar with the peppered moths. Can you find the moth on this picture? Well, you probably picked out this guy, right? Is that it? What about this one? Huh. What about here? Okay, so there's this one. Is that it? What about that one? See him hiding here? What is it about these populations that would cause this kind of variation? Are these two different species? Nope. So what's going on? They are two different color alleles. Why would this develop? Well, it's developed because this on the right side is the original condition of the trees. So what do you think the original moth looked like? Right, this guy. So why would this guy be present in that kind of environment? It's all random, right? If the alleles are there, their presence and appearance can be random. Is this one gonna survive? No way. He's a bird dinner in no time, right? So what's the deal over on this side then? Well, we have our original guy, but suddenly he's not faring so well, right? He's easy to spot. Now he's bird dinner. This guy that we laughed at before for being the wrong color is suddenly at an advantage, right? Which one of these is going to have more offspring? More offspring can only occur if you survive, right? So these two different environments are actually because this lichen is a mix of an algae, okay, and a fungus. Interesting organism in itself, but these lichen-covered trees were terrific for the original peppered moth coloration. But this alternate color pattern did very, very well later on. Why? Do you know? It actually is because the Industrial Revolution produced enough soot and debris in the air that it settled on the trees and covered the lichen. So this soot has actually changed the environment for these moths. Now the other color pattern will become more prevalent. In populations, we often look at ways to try to introduce math to this. We talked about Mendel before and the introduction of statistics to this process, but what we want to look at is whether or not our populations are statistically changing over time. We are not going to spend a lot of time on the Hardy-Weinberg principle, but what it basically says is that in a population, these allele or genotype frequencies will be in equilibrium unless something forces upon them, unless something in the outside environment, like the soot on our tree, does something to change the basic environment and will eventually change the population. Now, this was a theory produced in the early 20th century by Godfrey Hardy, who was a mathematician, and Weinberg, who was a physician. And they got together and said, hey, you know, there must be something going on here, that these populations will be stable unless something in the environment affects them. It's a good theory. This is what the equation looks like, where you're actually looking at the frequency of a common allele. This is not necessarily dominant. That's not the case here. Instead, they were looking at frequency of the appearance of different alleles in a population. P refers to the frequency of the more common, Q the less common. Often we associate this with dominant and recessive. So P squared would actually be your dominant, Q squared your recessive, and then 2PQ would be your heterozygote. Now, this principle is based on several conditions. If the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is going to hold for a population must satisfy all 5 conditions. It must be very large. There must be no gene flow. This means that no one between populations will interbreed. There are no mutations. So automatically, this should send up red flags for you. Mutations are random, right? They happen all the time in DNA replication. So to say that a mutation would never occur is kind of far-fetched. Random mating. This means that the next person that you bump into in the hallway is the person that you're going to have offspring with of the opposite sex, okay? So does that occur? Well, it does in some cases, but not often for populations. There is some selection going on, and mating is not entirely random. And then we have to look at the idea that there is no natural selection. So there is no trait that is going to make you more fit or less fit than another individual. Seriously? Okay, well, let's see how this works. Every time one of these things is impacted or changed, Hardy-Weinberg no longer applies. Small populations have high levels of change that are simply influenced by chance. Okay, so if you have a tiny population on an island, okay, and that tiny population is affected by flooding. So say we get high tides and it takes out part of your population. That population is going to be under significant stress that we're going to look at later. It's a phenomenon known as bottleneck of a population, and we'll look at it. Individuals cannot move in or out of the population according to Hardy-Weinberg. Think of a population where the individuals never move. You're going to be there a while. What about mutations? Mutations happen randomly. They can change or delete alleles entirely. They're going to happen. Preferential mating. Think about how you chose your boyfriend or girlfriend the last time. Was it because you bumped into them in the hallway? Well, it might have been, but then to carry on a conversation and become boyfriend-girlfriend, there's something else going on there. And then we have to look at the idea of natural selection. Natural selection says that not everyone is going to survive and reproduce. Hardy-Weinberg says, oh yes they are. Really? Do you have an equal chance of surviving and reproducing as the person next to you? Well, it works better for human populations in that regard, but think back to our peppered moths. Do they both have equal chances of survival and reproduction? Not a chance. So what we have to think about in microevolution is we're going to look at frequency of alleles. We're going to look at frequency of traits. Okay, if you want to look at it from a phenotype standpoint. Alleles look at it from the genotype, right? And we're going to look at why they change. Mutations, environment, dumb luck. We're going to look at how all of these things change alleles in a population and how that influences the population.